In unremarkable clothes, she blended into the back row, her presence quiet but deliberate. Most saw just another volunteer, a quiet veteran whose years under fire left no visible trace. When the instructor called for a tourniquet demonstration, her hand went up, unnoticed at first. But then her fingers moved with practiced precision, tying the bandage in seconds. The room fell silent as she explained the pressure needed to stop arterial bleeding, her steady voice carrying an authority that didn't match her appearance. No one asked where she'd learned it. They only watched, unsettled, as she faded back into the circle of folding chairs, notebook in hand. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting a pale wash over the basement classroom. A dozen people filled the metal chair, teachers, office workers, a crossing guardmost shifting in their seats as the instructor, a former paramedic with salt and pepper stubble, worked his way through slides on improvised splints. In the back corner, she sat with a legal pad balanced on her knees, her pen moving in small, efficient strokes. She didn't cross anything out, just recorded details as if she was cataloging each step for later review. When the instructor demonstrated chest compressions, her hands twitched, 2 fingers extending, curling back in, as if counting beats only she could hear. During break, while others gathered around the coffee urn exchanging stories about playground mishaps, she stayed put. She lined up her water bottle with the edge of the table, checked the label, then shifted it a millimeter until it was just right. She watched the room, taking in the exits, the way the chairs were arranged, the sound of the hallway beyond the door. "Remember, folks," the instructor called out, raising his voice over the low buzz of conversation, "this is basic first responder stuff. Nothing fancy needed." His gaze swept the group, pausing just long enough on the quiet woman in the back to note her lack of a certification badge. "We're not expecting combat medics here." The words hung in the air, a first hint, almost a question. A few people laughed, not noticing her pen stop mid-sentence, then resume. Later, a trainee wrapped a bandage too loosely around a mannequin's arm. She stood, walked over, and knelt beside him. Without a word, she adjusted the dressing, showing him how to tie the knot higher so it wouldn't slip. "You want it here," she said, tapping a spot 2 inches above the elbow. The instructor started to say something, then paused, watching her work. The bandage held tight under pressure. She watched each demonstration with a measured stillness, her eyes tracking the instructor's movements, never leaning in, just quietly assessing, as if checking each action against a list only she knew. During a mock hemorrhage drill, the assistant instructor caught her gaze. There was something in the way she studied the fake blood, the way her eyes narrowed, that made him falter for a moment. He recognized it not from classrooms, but from late shifts in the ER, when things went wrong. By lunch, a few people had moved their chairs closer, not to make conversation, but to watch how she unwrapped her sandwich, how she folded the wax paper, how she seemed to scan the room without ever turning her head. The instructor later mentioned that during the rib fracture section, her eyes had gone flat and distant, as if she was counting fractures from memory, not imagination. The afternoon wore on, the fluorescent light still flickering overhead. The instructors prepared for the next scenario, dragging a folding table to the center of the room, its legs scraping against the linoleum. At first, the group gathered around the instructor with a sense of easy confidence. They joked about their acting skills and passed around props, ready for the mass casualty drill the way you might be ready for a game. The instructor handed a script to Mark, the librarian, and reassured everyone, "This is all pretend. No actual injuries possible here." Mark stretched out on the table, while the instructor dribbled stage blood down his arm, explaining arterial spray patterns. The group watched, some half distracted, until Mark, playing along, let his arm loll off the edge. Then, with a sudden twist, his elbow slipped. The sound of his wrist hitting the floor cut through the room sharp and real. Mark's breath caught. His hand curled at an unnatural angle, purpling fast. Silence took over. The instructor stood frozen, clipboard hanging at his side. 2 people edged away from the table. Someone whispered, "That's real." But no one moved. From the back, her chair scraped. She was already on her feet, eyes moving from Mark's wrist to the exits, then to the trauma kit on the wall. Her steps were measured. She didn't ask if she should help. She just did. One hand steadied Mark's forearm, the other checked for a pulse, then swept his fingertips, then the pulse again. Each movement was deliberate, unhurried, the kind that comes from repetition, not nerves. The instructor tried to speak but stopped when she angled Mark's arm just so, aligning the fracture in a way that suggested she'd done it before many times, under worse conditions. "Tourniquet," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years stabilizing soldiers in Afghanistan with the 80-twand airborne. The assistant instructor fumbled with the kit, hands shaking, but she took the nylon strap and twisted it tight. The buckle snapped into place, white knuckles blanching under the pressure. Someone gasped. Civilian protocols said not to tourniquet fractures, but she was already checking capillary refill. "Splint material?" she said next, her tone leaving no room for question. The room moved around her, people scrambling to find supplies, the lead instructor watching her hands with a dawning realization. She didn't check the manual. She didn't hesitate. She monitored Mark's vitals, calling out numbers in crisp shorthand, updating the whiteboard with the neat, practiced script of a field medic. When EMTs arrived, they found her stabilizing Mark's arm, still tracking his pulse, still issuing instructions with quiet authority. The lead instructor reached for her shoulder, meaning to ask about her technique. "Prevents compartment syndrome," she said, already turning to the sink. She rinsed her hands under cold water, watching the pink swirl down the drain, her mind already moving to what needed to happen next. Muscle memory takes over when there's no time to think. In the space between the instructor's command and the first call to 911, she was already moving. Her hands deployed the trauma kit with one clean motion, scattering supplies across the table. She skipped the bright red civilian tourniquet and went for the emergency blanket's nylon strap, looping it tight around Mark's arm. The strap bit down. No hesitation. No wasted movement. She positioned herself close, body angled to shield Mark from the crowd. Her stance wasn't accidental, it was the kind of readiness that comes from years of scanning for threats and knowing exactly where to stand. Every action was deliberate, elbows tucked, movements compact, keeping the injury stable while still watching the room. Others hovered nearby, gloves dangling, waiting for direction. She didn't look up. When Mark's fingers darkened, she adjusted the strap with a practiced flick, never breaking rhythm. Her free hand reached for the clipboard, jotting vitals and time in a tight, efficient shorthand. The numbers were logged without pause, just as she'd done in field tents where every second counted. The lead instructor approached with a stretcher, but stopped when he saw her not something unfamiliar, too secure for a standard class. She caught his stare and, with a small adjustment, made the next one simpler, but the difference was already clear. Her resourcefulness stood out, using what was at hand, improvising under pressure, every step reflecting training that went beyond the basics. Paramedics arrived and took in the scene. Mark lay stabilized, vitals recorded, splint and tourniquet perfectly set. One EMT hesitated before reaching for his equipment, noticing her fingers already checking a pulse. Another glanced at the makeshift strap, recognition flickering across his face. The lead instructor watched as she cleaned the shears and repacked the kit, every item squared away, no wasted motion. Her routine was too exact, too ingrained. She checked Mark's pupils at intervals, braced the table to steady his arm, and stepped back only when the EMTs had him secure. As the gurney rolled away, she stood silent at the edge of the room, hands flexing unconsciously, every muscle still ready for what might come next. The others lingered, watching her, the energy in the room shifting now that the crisis had passed. She moved through the aftermath with the same steady control she'd shown during the crisis, gathering bandages and slotting them back into the trauma kit, fingers careful and precise. The kit closed with a soft hiss as she lined it up along the table's edge. The lead instructor lingered nearby, watching her hands. He cleared his throat, voice quieter now. "Before today, where did you train?" The question hung in the air, the room pausing around it. She stopped wiping down the table and met his gaze. 80 Twand Airborne, 2011 to 2017. The words were plain, almost clinical, but the effect was immediate. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone drew in a breath and held it. The instructor nodded, understanding more than he'd let on. The assistant instructor glanced at her rolled sleeves, noticing the faded tattoo just visible on her forearm. Nobody asked what it meant. The crossing guard, still clutching her purse, broke the silence. "Why didn't you say anything? During the lectures?" Her question echoed off the walls, louder than she'd intended. She looked up, the fluorescent light catching the thin scar running along her jaw. She paused, folding a piece of gauze into a perfect square. "You weren't teaching anything wrong." She set the gauze aside, her voice even, not defensive, just incomplete. That seemed to settle things. The instructors exchanged a brief look, but nobody pressed further. She finished cleaning, organizing the kit with practiced care, then picked up her notebook. The pages inside were filled with anatomical sketches and short, direct notes, nothing like the others' careful lists. The assistant instructor hesitated with the trauma strap. She didn't turn, but said, "Leave it looped counter, clockwise. Faster one-handed deploy." He nodded, accepting the correction. She intercepted the janitor's cart, adjusting the mop handle before it tipped. Small details, handled without thought, as if she was still in a place where everything had to be secured before moving on. No one asked about her civilian life. No one mentioned the way she'd assessed the room, or how she'd checked the EMT's boots as they arrived. The questions lingered, but she kept her distance, shouldering her bag military issue, but subtle. At the door, the lead instructor spoke again. "There's an advanced instructor course next month. We'd be glad to have you." She paused, just long enough to acknowledge the offer. "Appreciate that." Then she stepped out, the door closing quietly behind her. The room didn't return to normal. Even as people gathered their things, there was a sense that something had shifted. The next time they met, nothing would be arranged the way it had before. When the next session started, there was a new energy in the room. Chairs had been pulled into a semicircle around the trauma kits, the usual rows left behind. The lead instructor stood off to the side, manual in hand, but his posture was different, waiting, not lecturing. She walked in, glanced at the empty instructor's chair set out for her, then chose her familiar seat in the back. No one commented, but the gesture landed. Hemorrhage control drills ran again, but this time the assistant instructor paused mid-demonstration, hesitating over the pressure points. "Actually," he said, looking toward her, "maybe we should cover wound packing." She didn't move from her seat, but her explanation was direct. How to twist gauze for deep tissue injuries. How to keep pressure steady. She demonstrated the motion in the air, her hands precise. The instructors watched, exchanging quick, impressed looks. Someone in the front row mimicked her technique, then tried again until their hands matched hers. During break, a few trainees circled near her, pretending to organize their notes. One finally asked about using superglue in emergencies. She pulled a small tube from her bag and set it on the table. "Dermabond," she said. "Works better for shallow cuts. Just don't use it near the eyes." She pressed the edges of a torn paper scrap together, holding them until they sealed. 3 people wrote down the name. Later, the instructor who had once dismissed her cleared his throat. "About last week," he started. She shook her head. "No need." He nodded and handed her the marker for the next demonstration. She revised his splint diagram in 3 strokes, adjusting the angle, adding a line for weight distribution. The instructors leaned in, snapping photos with their phones, quietly updating their own notes. In the final exercise, she paired with the youngest trainee. He froze at the sight of fake blood, hands uncertain. She guided him through each step, voice steady, never touching, calling out corrections until his knot held. The relief on his face was obvious. Certificates came at the end. Hers was printed on heavier cardstock, participant, crossed out, and instructor, written above in bold block letters. She tucked it into her bag, fingers tracing the embossed seal just once. People lingered to talk, swapping contact info, taking photos. She stayed behind, refolding bandages and checking each trauma kit, every item returned to its place. Someone asked if she'd teach a weekend course. "I work nights," she said, closing the antiseptic wipes. It was just a fact. Before leaving, she paused at the bulletin board, eyes on the outdated protocol diagrams. She didn't say anything, but the next morning a revised flowchart appeared under the office door. The handwriting was unmistakable, every abbreviation sharp, every arrow straight. In the margin, a note. Updates per 2023 TCCC guidelines. No signature. After that, people began to notice the details she carried with her, even when she tried to keep them out of sight. When she set her bag down, it made a quiet, dense sound against the tabbly weight that seemed out of place in a community center classroom. During the emergency, a few of its contents had spilled out. A military-issue tourniquet, the webbing frayed but strong, a pair of vacuum-sealed Israeli bandages, expiration dates marked by hand in black ink, and, tucked beside them, a slim metal case containing a burr hole drill, its carbide tip dulled from use, not from neglect. These were not the sorts of items you found in standard first aid kits. The instructor's assistant nudged the Cyrillic-labeled hemostatic gauze, curiosity flickering. She caught his glance. "Quick clot alternative," she said. "Matter of fact. Half the price overseas." She slid it back into a mesh pocket, the motion automatic. Her kit showed its history in the details. The tourniquet's buckle was etched with faint scratches, a reminder of sand and gravel from places no one here had been. The Israeli bandages were packed with a precision that spoke of habit, each one folded to minimize bulk, ready to deploy in seconds. The burr hole drill, rarely seen outside of field hospitals, rested in its own compartment, the grooves cleaned but never quite free of grit. She didn't offer stories about where or when it had been needed. Some things were best left unspoken. Everything was organized for speed bandages in the front, shears blade down, tourniquet always on top. When she repacked the bag, her hands moved without hesitation, each item returning to its assigned place. The instructors watched, noting the methodical way she worked, the silent logic behind every choice. They recognized some of the equipment from documentaries, but the system was her own, refined by experience and necessity. Near the bottom of the bag, a flash of fabric appeared, a folded triangle, heavy cotton, edges worn. She tucked it away before anyone could see the patch or the stitching along the hem. The gesture was practiced, careful, neither rushed nor apologetic. No one asked what it meant. A few glanced at the faint outline it left, but nobody pressed for details. When she zipped the kit closed, the sound was final. Lifting the bag, the frame creaked under the weight built up over years and miles, from convoy medevacs and aid stations in Afghanistan to quiet classes like this one. She slung it over her shoulder and waited for the room to settle, her presence steady but never seeking attention. The training would end soon, and she would be gone as quietly as she'd arrived, leaving only the memory of what she carried behind. Some people move through a place and leave it changed, even if they never intend to. The ones who walk away do so quietly, their presence felt most in the routines they alter and the questions they leave behind. The last day of training ended with the usual shuffle, fluorescent lights humming, chairs pushed back, people gathering their things. She packed her bag with practiced efficiency while others compared phone numbers and stacked notebooks. The lead instructor met her at the door, pausing just long enough to offer an advanced trauma course and a paid position. She listened, nodded, and declined, her answer polite but final. "I work nights," she said, glancing at her watch. The shift implied hospital work, something with steady hours and little room for error. The instructor accepted her answer, sensing there was more to it, but didn't press. At the course completion ceremony, her name was called last. The agency director offered her a spot on the instructional team, the invitation public and sincere. She shook her head, the gesture small but unmistakable. Instead, she agreed to review the revised hemorrhage control protocols, her focus on the work rather than the recognition. In the parking lot, the assistant instructor caught her loading gear into an older sedan. He asked if she was sure about turning down the offer. She closed the car door, the faded 80 on the bumper just visible, and repeated, "Night shift." The way she checked her watch made it clear her life ran on rotations, the kind that didn't leave room for extra commitments. Her identity remained mostly untraceable. Instructors traded guesses, catching glimpses of a hospital badge or a certification card, but never enough to piece together a full story. Online searches led to a single news photo from a field hospital years ago, her face half-shadowed, hands steady on a wounded soldier. Beyond that, there were only fragments rumors of a nurse at County General, a woman directing bystanders at a highway accident, a fleeting image in a news segment after a factory explosion. What lingered was the work she left behind. Her training suggestions appeared in new diagrams on the classroom walls, her corrections inked in red. The assistant instructor found a sticky note on his manual, 3 bullet points in her handwriting, unsigned. She never returned to see the changes, but the instructors recognized the imprint of her experience in every revision. Months later, when the class gathered for refresher training, they set an extra chair at the back of the room. It stayed empty, but no one moved it. The sense of her influence remained, woven into the way drills were run and how instructors watched for quiet hands in the crowd. The manuals, too, began to change, pages updated, margins filled with new notes, each one a quiet continuation of her impact. Change rarely announces itself all at once. It moves quietly, carried by the hands of those who notice details others overlook. The updated training manuals arrived with a single new footnote at the bottom of the hemorrhage control section. Technique adapted from 80 Airborne Division Field SOPs. The pages themselves were clean, the diagrams sharper, but it was the small print that caught the assistant instructor's eye. He traced the asterisks, pausing before tucking the manual under his arm. In the months that followed, stories began to move through the local EMS circuit. At the hospital cafeteria, EMTs swapped accounts of a night shift triage nurse who could spot compartment syndrome without a second glance. She worked quickly, moving from bed to bed, her hands steady even when the department was overwhelmed. No one knew her name, but the way she packed wounds and checked pulses was unmistakable. The instructors recognized the style, the efficiency she taught without teaching, leaving behind a new standard for what competence looked like under pressure. Later that winter, during a mass casualty evacuation at a nursing home, the ER charge nurse described a woman who stabilized 5 patients in less than 15 minutes. She used wheelchair-adapted rapid extrication techniques, reworking the usual protocols on the fly. By the time the last ambulance left, she'd already vanished, but every cervical collar in the intake area had been adjusted with signature, precise twists. The nurse mentioned it during a quarterly audit, her tone somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "Not hospital protocol," she said. "Better." The training center's reference binder grew heavier. An unsigned email arrived with a link to foreign military medical studies passages highlighted, sticky notes comparing burn protocols, everything practical and direct. The assistant instructor printed the pages, adding them to the shelf without comment. The staff began to notice new faces at each session, some drawn by rumor, others by curiosity. A few asked about the medic from the previous course, hoping to learn something that wasn't in the handouts. Instructors, too, changed how they watched the room. They paid closer attention to the quiet ones, the people who sat in the back and kept their hands folded. When a reserved participant corrected a partner's splint or demonstrated a more efficient knot, instructors paused, reconsidered, and sometimes changed the plan for the day. The lessons were no longer just about protocols. They became about watching for the unexpected, about recognizing that expertise doesn't always announce itself. As the next class filtered in, the lead instructor lingered at the door, scanning the crowd. He looked for the ones who seemed ordinary, who didn't draw attention, who might carry something more than what showed on the surface. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, chairs scraped against the floor. Outside, the sky was already shifting toward evening. She folded her certificate along the creases, tucking it behind her grocery list. Outside, the parking lot took on the gray of early night. The others lingered by their cars, voices fading as they replayed the day's lessons, not realizing how much they'd learned from watching her. She adjusted her bag, the weight balanced, and walked past the group toward the bus stop. Across the street, a barista wiped down a counter. A jogger paused at the curb. She stepped into the crosswalk, blending in no fanfare, just quiet competence. How many others like her go unnoticed, their skills hidden in plain sight? If you know someone whose quiet expertise has changed your life, share their story in the comments. Let's honor those who serve without recognition.